Welcome to Civics and Coffee, a history podcast, the show all about United States history, delivered to you in the time it takes to enjoy your morning cup of coffee. I'm your host, Alicia, a historian trained in United States history with a passion for telling both the known and unknown parts of America's past. So grab your coffee and get ready for some bite-sized history. Hey everyone, welcome back. I am so excited for you to hear my conversation with Emma Duval about her first book, Unwed Unbothered. Emma is a researcher whose work shines a light on the often overlooked histories of women without children. Her debut book explores the lives of single women who never married and were frequently marginalized in the historical record. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hey everyone, joining me today is Emma Duval. She is an illustrator, a researcher, and author whose work shines a light on the often overlooked histories of women without children. She just published her first book, Unwed Unbothered, which will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Emma.
Hi, Alicia. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I've been a listener for years, and I'm just so excited to be here today.
Thank you so much for coming. As someone who's been watching you progress towards publication, I am so happy to have you here. I'm so happy the book is finally out in the world. So let's dive in. What generated your interest in studying women who lived outside of society's expectations?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? I mean, I think it comes from a kind of a personal journey of understanding myself. And the more I've been thinking about this question, which is often when people ask me, the more I think it's in a way me wanting to prove to society that there are so many women out there who lived outside the norms. And obviously, I'm focusing on women without children. And in this book, women who never married, but there are many ways you can define. It can be, gender norms, it can be appearances, it can be professions. So there's just so much happening that's outside of this kind of ideal of maybe, let's say, the trad wife, since that's kind of a topic that's coming up, or the get married, have kids, live. I wanted to kind of be able to be like, look at all of this. Look at all these names. Like, you don't even have to dig into their biography. They existed. And you cannot deny that basically the way I feel is not wrong or abnormal. I'm just one of maybe a minority group, but that still could represent a significant percentage. It was really interesting in my research. During medieval times, they estimate that up to 10-15% of women never married, sometimes higher numbers during periods of economic uncertainty, wars, or there are different events that obviously influence demographic. But even though we don't always have statistics, it was very interesting to see that, there's kind of always this baseline of, let's say, even 10% of women who never had children, or a higher number who never married for different reasons. So just finding those statistics from well-known researchers was very comforting to me. And then I wanted to be able to be like, how can I show that to the world? And so that's kind of how, this book idea came along, of trying to highlight a certain number, because I can't do it for everybody, but I wanted to be like, okay, how can I try to start this conversation of trying to show that throughout the centuries, throughout cultures, throughout continents, that there has always been women. And even though women's history is often erased or overlooked, despite all of these obstacles, I'm still able to find hundreds of names.
Yeah, and I think the critical thing that your book does is it really highlights that the history of women, like the history of any populous civilization, is nuanced, right? Women chose to live their lives in a myriad of ways, and not just what we might consider, quote unquote, normal or the expectation. So that's, I think, one of the things that I think your book really kind of contributes to the conversation is look at all this nuance throughout centuries, throughout cultures, right? And so I'm curious, how did you decide to focus on single women in your book?
Yeah, so it comes from a very pragmatic point of view, almost, of starting to dig into this and having, as I said, a long list, and then being like, okay, but how do I know that this information is accurate? Women who didn't have children, maybe it's just not mentioned in their history that they had, a miscarriage or, infant deaths. Like there are many reasons why it could just be glossed over. Married is usually like it's a legal thing, and so there's usually a better traceability. So I'll start with single women. It's a lot easier to say yes, no, they were married or they were not, and they're also more marginalized even than women who are married without children. So it was like women who are not married and don't have children, and how do they fit and where do they fit and what did they maybe express about their own feelings about their own lives, because a number of women that are in my book are known already, whether to historians in general or even to mainstream, they're well-known figures. But what I wanted to try and see is, can I find anything in a biography, in a memoir, in a letter, where they talk about their feelings, about their singleness or their feeling outcast or anything. And it's also to present, even as you said, all as much nuance as I can. Some women, it was a choice. Some others, it was circumstances. Some was a little bit of both. Some it was just the other path is just of, being married or becoming a nun is just unimaginable. So I'm going to stay single. There's many different reasons and we don't always know why. But that's kind of how I started wide, and then I kind of restricted it to women who were never married and didn't have children. Because I just want to say that there's an awesome history of single mothers that I came across, honestly, while doing this research of women who never married but had kids. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting, but outside the scope of what I'm doing right now. So yeah, there's, as I said, and that's technically also outside, the quote unquote norm. And so it was also interesting to come across their biographies. But that's for somebody else, hopefully, to do, because I think somebody who's maybe a mother would maybe relate to that a lot. But my mom was a single mom. So it was also, again, all of this is a very personal journey through getting comfortable with my own history through other people's history, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of the kind of the filtering that you had to do, you casted a super wide net, and then you really started to pare it down. You recount in your opening pages that you found over 500 women throughout history who never married. So how did you decide who should be included in the book?
That was such a hard process for me because obviously I had, favorites, or on the other side, there were women who I just didn't have enough information aside from, they were born, they never married, and they died, and maybe they, wrote something or they left a trace. That's why we know about them. There's too little information. So first of all, I had to filter all of those out. And then my main goal when I was kind of selecting these women was to get as much diversity as I can of cultures, religions, ethnicities, and centuries. So I have probably the largest segment I have is like 19th and 20th century, obviously, because that's the most recent history, and we have more of everything, archives and just bibliographies. When I have less subjects that are, from earlier times, it also means I have to also limit the number of subjects that come from later centuries. So how many do I have that go as far out as I can? How many do I have that are not from white American, European culture? And then I can start to add in more and more of my large of my large number. And that was the hard part, is like, there's it was like then I had to cut then I had to cut biographies because there's just not enough space. And so I had to be like, okay, which stories are the most relevant or the most telling? I still wanted to include women who were already known and almost, let's say, famous throughout history, because I was still hoping that I was bringing something that maybe isn't well known about them to the table. Their feelings about especially singleness or marriage or not having children. And for the other women, I was trying to be like, okay, so, maybe her life is fascinating to me, but I don't know how I can make a strong point with that. So that's where the editor and my agent helped me and be like, think about it as like, what does this bring? What does this person's biography bring that the others don't have? And if it doesn't, if it's very similar in some way, like maybe we need to, trim it down. So there was a lot of trimming down because I think I started wanting to be around 100 and we ended up around 60, unfortunately. But means I have it means I have a lot for future books.
Exactly. It's the start of a series.
Yeah.
Well, and considering the breadth of women that you covered, who are a few of the women who stood out to you during the research process that you really want future readers to look for?
So one that's in the book that I kind of always gravitate towards when telling people about is Jane Austen.
Mm.
And that's because she's so well known for her romances, I mean, oh, well, everybody knows, I guess. But there's so much um outside of her own books, there's been so many adaptations, TV shows, movies, like, and I've watched all of them. I love it, and I just love Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy and all of that. And I'm a big romantic at heart too. But what I thought is, to me, what's so interesting about her story is that she writes a lot about love stories, but also society. And I don't think it's obvious to a lot of people that she never married. She stayed single. Her sister was engaged, and her sister's fiance passed away while abroad, and her sister decided never to marry again, possibly broken heart. That might have not been as much of a choice. We know that Jane Austen got proposed to by a family friend that was relatively wealthy, which she could have gone down that track. Instead, she accepted a proposal, and then the next morning, she said, "No, never mind." We don't really know why, which is also really interesting to think about. And so she stayed single, and she basically lived with her sister her whole life. She had nieces and nephews that she adored, and one of the things that is interesting in this dynamic is that, in a way, she was a little bit of a burden economically on her family. Her father first, and then he passed away, and then her brothers, who had wives who passed away in during childbirth or after childbirth as well, which is tragic. But she had brothers who had to support her mother, her sister, until, like, because she only started to make money towards the end of her life. And she died just a few years after her first books kind of made it big. So contrary to, let's say, Louisa May Alcott, to name another very famous literary novelist, who became quite wealthy and lived on her own and seemed to have been very content being, a single woman with independence and wealth. It wasn't the case for Jane Austen. So it's really interesting to me that despite being associated with all this romance and these marriage proposals and all of that that atmosphere, that her life was completely different, that she knew what she was, let's say, burdening, because that's the word, her family with, by refusing to get married because she was proposed to. She could have said yes. It's interesting how different her life is in a way. But then I remember it was my agent told me, I think, that it was interesting because a lot of her stories actually do end at the marriage point. Like, you don't see what happens after. So maybe there's something there also about, like, they got married, but she didn't feel like it was interesting enough for her to write about their life after. I don't know. There's a lot of speculation that you can do. I think I mentioned it in her story, is that I I do believe that seeing relatives and friends struggle within marriage, die due to childbirth complications, I do think it influenced all of that. And of course, when I say this, I am projecting a little of myself onto her story. But I think it's her story, to me, that's in the book, is really interesting because it's so unexpected in a way, because you wouldn't, well, who expects Jane Austen not to be married to a Mr. Darcy in real life? So that's what I would say for who's in the book. Um, and then, as I said, I had to trim down a lot, and there are some women that I couldn't feature that I was a little bit heartbroken about. And one of them is Mary Golda Ross, and so she was from the Cherokee Nation, and she became this pioneer scientist who worked in the aerospatial area in like the 1950s. At the time, she was often the only woman and even only Native American on her team. She worked at this big corporation that worked on super secret projects. So she worked on secret projects that are still to this day confidential that we don't know about. And her story to me was so interesting because she was on TV.
Oh,
It's not a it's like it's today you wouldn't know about her in the same way that we know about some of the other women I've portrayed, like Greta Garbo and Jane Austen and Florence Nightingale. But when I saw the clip of her appearing in the 50s on a famous TV show called What's My Line, and you can watch it, and I was like, "Oh my god, how famous does that mean she was at the time?" Like it's
right.
hard to really get an idea. But it was interesting because I think they had to guess her profession. Obviously they didn't because she was this, beautiful, gorgeous woman dressed, in a dress and nicely. And I don't think they would ever guess that she was, an aerospatial engineer. Her whole story to me was just one of that kind of is modern enough that I was like, oh, this is so exciting. And I do want to mention that she was part of the Society of Women Engineer, and I spoke to the president of the Silicon Valley, Santa Clara Association because I wanted to know more about her because they had a lot of information. And I was so grateful to have this call and be like, hey, do you know anything more about her than what's online? Was she married? Like, was she not married? Do you have, like, is there any information? And we were able to talk about her a little bit. And I was so excited to include her in the book so I could share it to the president of at the time in 2021.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, due to the same issue of being the 20th century, having so many amazing women to include, I didn't have room for her in this book. But she's very dear to my heart because her story is groundbreaking in different ways. She's a pioneer in so many different ways. She went into a field that is still so difficult for women sometimes to break through.
Yeah.
She never married. She never had kids. She lived independently. She wasn't on TV. There's so many things that make her so interesting to me, at least. And again, I
Yeah.
understand that maybe for somebody else it's just like, oh, it's just one other story. Like what does this tell me about how singleness is viewed in society? And not much, because she didn't leave autobiographical material that I can use to kind of present her point of view. I don't know at all her point of view. So that's unfortunately one of the reasons I couldn't include her in this book. And then the other one that I often think about is Vivian Mayer, who I think
Mm.
is at this point relatively well known in America for her, street photography work that kind of was, like, the stories. She was a nanny. She took hundreds of pictures. Nobody knew about them until, these collectors found them soon before her death, around 2009, 2010. And then they were like, oh, this is great work. They did an exhibit when I was in Chicago. It was the first time I moved to the US. I was going to school, and I went to this exhibition at the Chicago Public Library about Vivian Mayer. So I kind of came across her work at a very transitional time in my life. And and she also lived in France for, like, she kind of went back and forth. So that is another story that to me, I have emotional ties to that stories. But again, there's not a lot left about her own feelings. There's no,
Mm.
writings. She was a recluse. Maybe, she wouldn't feel comfortable being talked about. There's so many things that, I can't really tell that aren't already known. So she wasn't able to be presented either. But those are the kind of stories that to me, again, are really interesting. And I hope one day I'll have a chance to talk about them more. But yeah, as I said, it had to be efficient, accessible, and really tried to have each biography kind of really brings something to the overarching point of view, which is what did their individual story mean about how we as a society perceive single women, how single women perceive themselves, and kind of showing the misogyny and the patriarchal impact that has always existed and still continues today.
Well, I know one of the women that I really loved learning about was Eleanor Eldridge. So, can you talk a little bit about her story and maybe how you came to learn about her?
Yes, her story is really one that's quite impressive. And while I don't exactly remember how I came across her, I am pretty sure it was in one of Jessie Carney Smith's dictionaries. She wrote a couple Black women, notable Black women in America. She did a lot of work to highlight the stories of Black women in the 18th to 20th century. And so I did go through her work a lot because there were bibliographical dictionaries. So super useful to what I was doing. It was exactly what I needed. And I think I came across her story at a point where I had a number of women, that were, I had a lot of white women from medieval times to modern times, and I was trying to diversify. I was looking for women who had autonomy. That was a big thing. And I mentioned it briefly in the introduction that the autonomy is a huge part of it, which is why not including women who might be considered in positions where they had not enough bodily autonomy for legal reasons or other reasons. So when I came across her story, I was like, okay, she was born a free woman at a time where slavery still wasn't abolished. It still existed in the US. She made enough money through her skills. She did soap and she did a lot of manual things. She was illiterate. She did a lot of manual business. She was able to use the money she made with all these businesses to invest in land and become a landlord. Obviously, she had to face a ton of obstacles, and one of them included that throughout times of her life when she had to go away, at one time there was like an outbreak. I can't remember if it was typhoid, but one of those outbreaks that, people were like, I'm just going to move away for a few months. I'll come back when it's calmed down. And she did that. And while she was gone, people were like, oh, she's dead. So, I got dibs on her land and on her things. And so she came back and she had to fight for it. And she was able to do that with the help of a white female author who kind of transcribed her story, which is called The Memoirs of Eleanor Eldridge. And by publishing that book, they raised enough money for her to have the fees to fight in court and to eventually win. And then they published a second book about a bit more of her story. But that first book, The Memoirs of Eleanor Eldridge, is really interesting because it has a quote. It has a quote about how she was, in my opinion, very pragmatic. It's basically, why her aunt told her, "Don't bother marrying; it's a waste of time." And the quote in the book is basically like, "Well, you guys are getting married. I can sell 5 pairs of socks and just make more money." And so it's a very interesting to me perspective because of the time and place that she was born in. And those were stories that are so difficult to come across. I'm always surprised that her story isn't as well known just because it's so kind of out of the box in many ways. But then when you start to read literature from that time and people from that time, they did know about her, they did write about her. It's just, again, it gets little bit lost throughout history. And I'm so grateful that, again, we are able to have her memoirs and have this very personal quote that hopefully did come from her and was not added in by anyone. But yeah, it's very interesting to have for the late 18th century, early 19th century, to have this woman a woman of color who is illiterate, who does not come from wealth, basically become a self-made woman before self-made women were a thing. So yeah, that one's also one that I thought was really interesting, and so I'm glad you liked her story as well.
Yeah, I mean, I read that one. The entire book obviously is filled with just amazing, fascinating stories. Your writing is super accessible. I love seeing that one because as a historian of the United States and of women, she was not somebody that was on my radar. So I always love being surprised in a book and seeing women kind of overcome the odds. And I think that's why I resonated so much with her story. And so we already kind of talked about some women that you wanted to include but couldn't. But curious, was there anyone who you desperately, desperately wanted to include in the book, but just the editors or the process said, nope, you can't include this person?
Honestly, a lot of the women that I couldn't include were 20th century, often white American or European women, just because, again, I had so many of them, which is not a lot in the grand scheme of things. It's just it was too many when I was trying to, make sure that it stayed as diverse as I could. And the other day, I saw a post on social media about Gertrude, and I don't know how to pronounce her last name, Ederle. She was German origin, so I'm never sure how to pronounce her name in an Americanized way. But she was one of the first women who swam across the channel between France and the UK. And there's this famous photo of her, and she's sturdy. She's a strong woman, and she's like all greased up because of the water's so cold. They basically at the time greased them up, and she set that record for women to like swim through the channel and make it on the other way. And I was like, oh, so cool! I can like highlight that she's in the book. And I was like, oh no, I had to cut her out. I forgot. She was one of the ones that I couldn't include in the book because again, while her story is fascinating in the sense that it's history making for women in sports. She physically, did not fit the beauty standards. Short hair, as I said, she was real strong. She was an athlete. And when she came back to the US after swimming successfully across the channel, because a number of women had done it unsuccessfully. So she was the first one to do it successfully. And she had a whole parade in New York when she got back. And her life is again also really interesting, but I did not have enough about her personal life, about why maybe she remained single. Was there a reason for it? Was it just circumstances? So again, it was one of those stories that just was like, well, not for this one, maybe for the next one. But it made me think because again, sometimes I'll see something and I'm like, oh, I have her. And I'm like, no, she unfortunately got the cut. So yeah, um, I'm going to say I almost had her in the book, but it just feels rude.
Well, and kind of taking a step back and considering kind of the larger picture, what themes emerged for you when researching these women?
I think what I really learned through this process I got is kind of a version of sisterhood. So one of the reasons that I got such a high number of women on my list, which I'm hoping to make public one day, I'm working on that. But is that when you read about one, you find another name in there that's like her cousin, her friend, whatever, and then her friend has also like a cousin, a friend, or whatever, and they all like kind of creates this like little network, little spider web of spinsters, single women at the same time who knew each other. And so it's kind of interesting is these clusters of women that I have. That was really interesting to me because it might feel like these stories are just like one woman, one place, one time, and then you jump to another place, another time. But actually, they all had other names connected to them that I wasn't able to include. So it's just really interesting how much more you discover once you dive into one of their lives. This kind of idea of clusters of single women throughout time, and it always happened. And to me, that was really interesting. Was where they brought close together because they made the same choices, or was it like they all feel marginalized? I'm not exactly sure how they came to know each other, but there's always these kind of groups that form. That was really interesting. And then what was really interesting is to come across women who really said, no matter what time we are, what culture, what ethnicity, basically said, I'm going to do what I want. And again, oftentimes it's because they had some kind of privilege, right? Even if it was, let's say, during the medieval times, there are often women who come from a certain level of wealth, or, they come from a family that has a little bit of power and they're able to say, I don't care, I'm not getting married, no matter what you say. But it was fascinating because you always get this idea that, women almost had no agency. And it's like, wow, like it feels hard today sometimes to say, I don't want to be married, or I don't want to have kids, or I want to do this differently. It feels like there's so much still societal pressure. And then I looked through their stories. I'm like, how did they do that 1,000 years ago without knowing that, all these other women maybe made the same choices? Like, I would be petrified, but there's women that were like, no, I'm just not going to do it. Because it feels sometimes unbearable in the 21st century, and I have access to, as I said, all these rights that didn't exist at the time, and I have very supportive family, and it's like I'm just in awe, I'm gonna say, of how they were able to stand up to a society that was not welcoming
Yeah.
of their rebellion.
Yeah. Well, and, as researchers, we know that there are certain topics that are a little bit harder to research than others, and researching women kind of poses its own unique hurdles. So curious, what were some of the challenges you faced in researching these women?
That's a that's very simple. Availability of information.
Yeah.
And this is where I have to say shout out to all the women researchers who came before me, because 90% of the work I did has been built upon the work that women researchers, professors, historians have done before me. Sometimes it's just women who wrote about their friends to so that there was a trace in history. But sometimes it's especially from the 70s, there was this kind of increase in women looking into women's history. At some point, I was realizing that really, like, I almost have no biographies about any of these women that are written by men. There are some books about general history, which might mention one of the women I was interested in that were written, by men. But like I was just kind of shocked at how much I had to rely on the work of relatively recent scholarship from the 70s up to just a few years ago even. Some books were just recently published when I was looking into these stories. And I was just thinking, if I had tried to do this 20 years, 30,
Hmm.
50 years ago, I don't think I would have gone as far. And so the accessibility of information and this kind of scholarship created by women for women's history was just showing to me, how important it is. And again, I'm sure it's applicable to other minorities or other under overlooked histories. But it's like, yeah, if if we had to rely on just general scholarship, and we would be missing out on a lot of information. So the biggest challenge was often to find personal history,
Yeah.
letters, memoirs, everything that gets destroyed through just paper. Just it doesn't exist anymore. 50, 100 years, 200 years later. I am very grateful anytime that I could find more than just two lines of information. And when it's not modern historians' work, when we're looking back really further out, almost towards the antiquity, it's often because those women were so extraordinary that
Mm.
even the men at the time were like, well, I'm going to talk about her. So unfortunately, it's really I don't have a lot of just average or quote unquote normal women to present, because the ones from really far back were just so amazing, so extraordinary that men were like, well, you know what? I'm going to include her in one of the three female poets within my 500 male poets authorship. But more recently, I don't think she's in my book, but Anne Lister is a good example of that.
Mm.
She's often referred to as the first lesbian of English history because she lived well, there is a TV show about her, by the way, if anybody's interested. But she had this kind of secretly coded memoir, biography, journals that she wrote. And I believe that it was decoded early on by men who were not interested in the story. And in the 70s, female scholars also kind of went back through these archives, found her writings, and made them accessible. And then we kind of were made aware, thanks to the work that these women did, of her life, which was one of a, let's say, semi open lesbian in 19th century in England who dressed in a way that is very like male attire. She was
Mhm.
very, she married, quote unquote, I'm going to say quote unquote, married one of her lovers in a ceremony because they decided, they wanted to consider themselves married. Obviously, at the time, gay marriage wasn't at all a right, but like she did all these things that are so modern, which is why she's kind of become a little bit of an icon. And that TV show, I think it's called Gentleman Jack, if I'm not wrong. Again, her story today is only known because female scholars, again from 70s, 80s, 90s, and again, even some, as I said, really recently, have devoted their time and effort to uncover those stories, to really go dig and find what is not made accessible. And then I'm very lucky because as a non-historian, not affiliated to any university, I'm still able to get access to these books, whether it's through, libraries, or sometimes it's open journals, online, or just available for purchase. And
Yeah.
it's like I'm so grateful that I'm able to kind of to benefit from the work that they did, because yeah, without it, I would not be anywhere. This book would not exist, honestly.
Well, and that's a good segue, I think, to the next question that I have is I always love to tie the past to today. And so what can studying these women tell us about our present moment?
I think, in short, looking at this book and at the histories of women from 1,000 years, 500 years ago to today is just nothing has really changed. Unfortunately, to me, is one of the takeaways. And again, especially in the last year or so in the US, there's been this kind of push of this trad wife aesthetic of trying to convince through social media often that this 1950s ideal of the housewife with a husband who works, the wife doesn't work, they have multiple kids, and they have a house, that this is the norm, when it just hasn't at all. Whether it's women working, women have always worked, whether it's, women not having children. As I said, there's statistics like, just, I mean, infertility itself means that a certain number of women will never have children, and then other women never marry. So it's kind of like, as I've seen this kind of rhetoric take more and more place, I've been a little bit worried that we're going backwards, unfortunately, in the sense of accepting lifestyles that are not considered this heterosexual norm of married with, well, two kids, white picket fence, the whole story. And so, in a way, to me, when I look at this book, I'm like, oh man, oh, I wish things had changed more, but unfortunately, it hasn't. And yeah, the people are still, calling women who don't have children crazy cat ladies, or spinsters sometimes. And there's been some movement to try and reclaim those words. But even you see it often on coverage about celebrities, women who
Hmm.
decide not to have children, or who don't have children by a certain age, or aren't married by a certain age, etc. You see how much vitriol they get. And it's a little bit scary, because I feel for everybody who is alone, maybe doesn't have a support family, maybe grows up in a household that has very strict religious values, which I can relate to some of that. I will say, at least in my opinion, when I look back, I'm like, things really just haven't changed, but also the history cycles through.
Yeah.
And so even when I was looking through all these centuries, I saw the ups and downs of, like, oh, there's like an increase in single women and their rights. So they start, the femme sole status exists here, and it gives them a little bit more rights technically than married women, and then it takes a dip, and then it goes back again. I'm hopeful that it'll just continue again, the cycle of history. But at the same time, we also have still a lot of rights that weren't available to women from the past. I just hope that the trend continues, and that this Gen Z generation that is supposedly going to be, up to, what is it, 25%, are going to probably not have kids. There's the
Yeah.
statistics that have been out recently by the time they're 40. So we'll see in 20 years where things are. But my hope is that anybody who feels pressured and comes across this book realizes that they are not an anomaly, they're not weird, they're not alone, that there's this long history. And that's one of the reasons I wanted the diversity, because while I'm, a white European female, I wanted anybody from any religion or ethnicity to feel like they're not forgotten. Like, they had also women that they can look up to, feel reflect in their identity and their values, that chose a path that they feel might be the right one for them.
Yeah. Well, and that actually covers the next question that I had for you, which was, what do you hope readers take away from this book? But I do want to give you an opportunity. Do you have any other things that you wish and hope readers take away from your book?
My biggest dream would be, as I said, to have this whole trope of the single childless woman not be a trope anymore. I know it's a
Hmm.
huge ask. I know. Uh, well, especially in the media. And they've seen improvements, but it's terrible how you can still look at the, movies that came out within the last 10 years, and, see women who are over a certain age and who don't have kids, who are just terrible characters. I don't know why I'm thinking right now about, it's a bit older, but Glenn Close in that movie where she boils the rabbits.
Oh,
And
Fatal
he's
Attraction.
yes, Fatal Attraction. again, it's like, it's not just this once movie. It's that it's always a recurring theme. And one of the things I don't really get into the book because it's outside of what I do, but I thought it was always fascinating to kind of see where the folklore, what happens in folklore with witchcrafts and stories about the Baba Yaga and all these villainous characters and fairy tales that vary from country to country and culture to culture, but like really interesting to see how this idea of the witch is going to be, like wants to take your baby away. The single woman that doesn't have kids, she's going to curse you and she's going to try and take your baby. Or queens who weren't able, for whether they were infertile or their husband was, which obviously the husband never gets to blame. People are making fun of their bodies, their wombs, their barrenness. Like there's just so many ways in which women who are either single or not married have been made fun of. And I go a little bit over it, but whether it's like it's just not the terms that exist compared to what exists for men, which is nothing. A bachelor is not considered pejorative in any way, and that's kind of the only term to describe a single man. When you start to look at women as well, like spinster, and there's like older terms that are thornback is like someone who is older than a spinster, like over. So there's all these terms that exist to pejoratively attack women. Again, I'm going on a little bit of a tangent just to mention that, I mean, I'm sure your listeners know, but the origin of the spinster is that there were women who were single and making money by spinning the wheel. And then it becomes somehow a pejorative term for single women. And as I said, it still kind of exists today in the way that childless millennials are being perceived in the media. So I would hope that we can move away from the stigma. And as I said, unfortunately, with the recent rise in certain politics, I don't see that happening. But I do hope that it also means that there are still safe havens, let's say, for people to feel comfortable in the life choice that they make. And that goes for all the life choices and all identities that have been marginalized and have only seen a little bit of acceptance in the last, 50 or 20 years. So, yeah, my biggest takeaway hopefully is that hopefully I don't sound too negative. It's just when you look back at history and you start to compile all the laws against, single people and all the attacks that, people have gone through, it's like, it can be a little bit distressing. But that's where the stories to me are also uplifting. It's like, no man, despite all of that, these women, they lived their lives and they made enough of a mark in history that they have not been able to be erased from mainstream history.
And so where can readers find out more about you and the work that you do?
Yeah, so my main website is millennialemma.com, but I also run a smaller website that I'm hoping to be able to work more on, which is called the Child Free Museum. And that is something that I'm trying to expand on, is the history of women without children. And it includes both single, married, unmarried, all kinds of women, but it's really to really focus more on the childless/child-free part. And so it's in no way a museum. It's just named that way because I'm trying to present this history in a way that I haven't seen it presented yet. And I'm hoping to eventually put my database on there so that it can be filtered, by century or by ethnicity or by profession. So that's where my work is going right now. Also because there's actually been a growing numbers of scholars who are working on the single studies, like actual scholars from universities. And they recently created, it's called ISSA, and it's this network for all these academics that are working often on social studies, demographics, and really kind of trying to make single studies be more recognized as an actual subfield, maybe, of gender studies. So it's really interesting, and I think that they will have a lot more to add to the conversation on everything that relates to history of single people. So yeah, my goal is to kind of move more towards childless, child-free community.
Nice. Well, and before I let you go, is there anything that we haven't covered that you want future readers to know?
I would just say, if you take a look at the introduction, I have listed some great authors whose work has really been instrumental in inspiring me I wish I had almost written more about each of them to be like, this is why you should read their book. This is why they're amazing. But I would really encourage people who have been interested in the book to take a look at these other writers that I mentioned in the introduction, because I do think that as much as I tried to make a version of history accessible, they have treated things in more in depth than I have, but also more specific to certain regions or cultures or areas. But I just want to highlight that because again, their work has been so inspiring to my work. So I just feel like I need to make sure that people don't skip the introduction because there's a good list for you to be read.
Very nice. Well, to all the listeners out there, please consider picking up a copy of Unwed and Unbothered. It is an accessible read, and it covers women throughout the world and throughout history. Get it for your daughters, get it for your nieces, get it for your wife. You won't be disappointed. Emma, thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was really a pleasure.
Thanks again to Emma for coming on and sharing your work with me. I am so excited to see where it goes. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you Saturday. Thanks for sitting down with me as I explored this chapter of American history. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.